On December 12, 2019, Heidi Broussard, who was 33 years old, took her 6-year-old son to his school in Austin, Texas, around 7:30 in the morning. Heidi had her 2-week-old baby, Margot, with her. When Heidi's partner Shane returned home from work, he was surprised not to find Heidi in their apartment, even though her car was parked in its usual spot and her belongings, including the diaper bag for the baby, were still there. The only thing missing was Heidi's cell phone. Shane felt that something was wrong with the situation. He picked up their son at after-school care, and when he picked up his son, he asked his staff there for his daughter too, and he immediately knew something was wrong. They didn't have Margot. She was still too young for daycare, and wasn't due to start for several more weeks. It was at that point that Shane called the police to report his wife and daughter missing, and an extensive investigation began. Shane made this plea to the media for the safe return of his wife and child. Immediately, this case took the media by storm. Many parallels were drawn between Heidi and the horrific murders carried out by Chris, who had been convicted of murdering his wife and 3 children in 2018. Unfortunately, Shane bore a significant amount of scrutiny during this time, with many people on social media claiming he was guilty. After a few days with little headway in the case, the Austin Police Department brought in the FBI to assist with its investigation. They were able to determine from witnesses that Heidi had returned the morning that she disappeared, shortly after dropping her son off. But no one saw her leave the building after that. Her phone had been turned off since her disappearance, and the last time it had pinged was at the apartment. Both Shane and Heidi's mother stated that there was no way Heidi had left voluntarily. They said in this statement, she wouldn't leave, not without an ID, all of her cash in her purse. Her purse is here, her car is here, and she's a talker. She loves to talk. She loves her friends. She loves her family. And she would tell somebody, and all of her friends don't know. Her mother went on to say this, it's only her and the baby and the cell phone and her keys that are missing, and that's it. Both Heidi's mother and Shane adamantly stated she never would have left her son behind. As the investigation progressed, a witness from Heidi and Shane's apartment complex came forward. They stated that on the morning of Heidi's disappearance, they had seen her talking outside of the building with a woman. They said that they saw the baby was with them, and that they watched as Heidi got into the vehicle parked outside the building, and that woman drove off with Heidi and the baby in the vehicle. Officers showed the witnesses a lineup of known people in Heidi's life, and the witness pointed out Heidi's best friend, Megan Veramusca. Heidi and Megan had been friends since they were teenagers and had met at church camp. Megan had been present at the birth of both Heidi's children and had even stayed at their apartment to help out after Margot's birth. Megan even had a key to their apartment. Officers continued their investigation and were able to confirm that Megan had seen Heidi that morning of her disappearance with surveillance and tracking where her phone had pinged on December 12th. Megan lived in Houston, Texas, 162 miles away from Austin. Texas Rangers were dispatched to check out the home, and once there, they sent up a helicopter to get aerial surveillance and noticed that a vehicle registered to Megan was parked in the backyard of the home. It was noted as odd as it wasn't like a driveway or some sort of parking spot in the backyard. It was just like a normal home backyard, and the vehicle was like parked on the grass. It looked more like they were trying to conceal the vehicle rather than it being a practical place to park it. Texas Rangers were watching the house and saw a man leave the residence. They followed him to a local Target. They approached him and asked who he was. He revealed that he was Megan's ex-boyfriend. The couple had separated months prior, but had continued to live together when he was told that Megan was pregnant. Officers asked about the pregnancy and noted its close proximity to Heidi's pregnancy. They asked about the birth, and he said it had taken place while he was out of town, and she had given birth to a girl that she named Luna May. They showed this man a photo of Marco, who confirmed looked exactly like Luna May. Law enforcement was allowed into the home by Megan's ex-boyfriend. When they entered, they spoke to Megan, who couldn't recall where she'd given birth. She couldn't show officers any sort of records that matched with Luna May, and officers found that incredibly suspicious. On December 19th, Megan Veramusca was arrested, and the baby was taken from the home and put into child protection until a DNA test could be conducted. DNA for the baby was confirmed to be Margot, and she was returned to her father's care. During a search of the home, officers found several suspicious internet searches on a device. Google searches for reasons for Amber Alert in Austin, and 162 searches for Heidi Broussard starting from December 12th. Officers also searched the vehicle that was in the backyard, and there they made the devastating discovery. Heidi's body was found in the trunk of the vehicle. A week after Heidi and Margot's abduction, there were now some answers, but more questions remained. It appeared that Faramuska had premeditated this attack for months, maybe even years before she carried it out. When Heidi revealed to friends that she was pregnant, that was when Megan announced that she was also pregnant and had the same due date. That Megan had been possessive over the newborn. But all these red flags had been just that. Red flags concerning behavior. No one thought Megan was capable of this kind of violence. In January 2020, she was charged with capital murder, tampering with a corpse, and 2 counts of kidnapping. An autopsy revealed that Heidi had been strangled to death and the murder weapon was alleged to have been a dog leash. Faramuska's trial has been delayed several times due to COVID, but she has been in the Travis County Jail awaiting trial since her arrest in 2020. She is being held on a $1.6 million bond. If convicted, she could face the death penalty. In March of this year, she had her first court hearing and her defense mentioned to remove evidence collected from the day she was arrested. They argue that law enforcement didn't have a warrant to enter the home, and Texas Rangers defended their actions, saying there was a young child who had reason to believe to have been kidnapped. There had been a strong smell of decomposition at the property and had acted accordingly with a suspect who was capable of murder and kidnapping. They stated that when they saw the baby, she appeared to have jaundice, and for that reason, they couldn't wait for a search warrant. They also had permission from the ex-boyfriend to enter the property, who was also on the lease as a tenant. They even have him on body cam saying, "She is not my child, are you serious? Go get that baby. What are y'all waiting for, man?" Texas Rangers arrived at the property at 1 p.m. and the search warrant wasn't approved until 8:30 p.m. Faramuska's attorneys are trying to get any evidence, testimony, and anything else collected before 8:30 p.m. thrown out of the trial. The state cited 3 exceptions justifying the search and seizure of the home at the time. 1. Law enforcement isn't required to show probable cause when action is immediately necessary to protect human life. 2. There was an objective standard of reasonableness to enter given the facts and circumstances of the case. And 3. Consent was given by someone authorized to provide consent, allowing Texas Rangers to enter the home without a warrant. And Texas Rangers also stated that once the baby was removed and in safety, they made everyone exit the home, conducted only a safety sweep, and waited until the warrant arrived. Only then did they open the vehicle, which they had already determined to be the source of the smell. They stated that they only immediately entered the home to preserve evidence and get the baby to safety. It does appear that the trial is still set to go forward. At this point in time, there hasn't been a trial date set, just a few smaller court proceedings just to get both sides ready for court. There is also still an option for a plea bargain or an admission of guilt, which may mean that no trial goes forward. We will just have to wait and see, and I will keep an eye on the situation and update when there is something new. What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Min Lin and his wife Yun Lin, also known as Lily, were caring parents and a dedicated couple. They met in Sydney after moving from China as students, got married, and had 3 children. Henry, who was 12 years old, Terry, who was 9 years old, and Brenda, who was 15 years old. Brenda described her parents as loving, attentive, and hardworking, always putting their children first. Henry was passionate about sports, especially badminton, and was outgoing and popular. Terry looked up to his older siblings, especially Brenda, whom he followed everywhere. The Lin family was very close-knit, and the siblings had a strong bond with each other. Min and Lily worked hard to give their 3 children the best life and education they possibly could. Min set up the Epping Central News Agency in 2002, which became a fast-growing and lucrative business, turning over more than $1 million a year. The news agency was always bustling and busy, and the Lin family quickly became very well known and respected within the local community. The family lived on Boundary Road, in a nice suburb of North Epping. Lily's sister Irene also moved into Boundary Road with them. Irene worked part-time at the news agency to help Min and Lily. Min had bought his parents, Yang Fei Lin and Fei Ching Su, a new home about a 30-minute drive away from them. Min and Lily also lived a short walk away from Min's sister Kathy, her husband Lien Binzi, known as Robert, who was previously an ear, nose, and throat specialist in China, and their son. Both Robert and Kathy migrated to Australia in 2002. On Friday, July 17th, the Lin family went to Min and Kathy's parents' house for dinner. This was a regular weekly gathering, and everyone apart from Brenda was there as she was away on a school excursion. Henry's grandmother asked him to stay over that night. However, he declined due to having plans with his uncle Robert the following day to play badminton. Min left his parents' home at around 9 p.m. to deliver some newspapers for the following morning. Eventually, the whole family headed back to their home on Boundary Road. Early the following day, chatter amongst locals started. Min's news agency was unusually closed, and the newspapers had mounted up outside the store without being taken in. It was a busy Saturday morning, and Min not opening his agency without any warning was a cause for concern. Min's sister Kathy received a phone call from a worried customer asking what was going on. Following this, Kathy and her husband Robert headed straight over to the Lin family home, less than a 5-minute walk away. At around 9 a.m., they reached the house and found the door was unlocked. Downstairs, everything appeared as expected. Nothing was disturbed, but the house was eerily silent, and no one was responding to Kathy and Robert's calls. Heading up to the second floor, however, it was a very different story. They were met with a terrifying sight. In the master bedroom lay Lily's body. She had been bludgeoned to death and the room was full of blood. Upon making their way through the rest of the upstairs floor, each room had an equally horrifying scene. Irene's body was found in her room, slumped against her bed. Min and Lily's 2 young sons Henry and Terry were also found dead in their bedroom across the corridor. Blood completely covered the walls, floors, and ceilings in each room, and the crime scene and the murders would go down as one of the most brutal in Australian history. Min Lin, however, was nowhere to be found. Kathy dialed 000 for an ambulance. Towards the end of the call, a hysterical Kathy could be heard pleading with her husband, Robert, begging him not to leave her alone in the house. She was heard saying in Cantonese, "I am more scared than you are." But Robert insisted he had to go and pick up hers and her brother's parents, leaving a frantic Kathy in the house alone. Police and paramedics arrived on scene and were met with Kathy at the front door, screaming for help. Min was still unaccounted for, but on Kathy's advice the police did a further search of the master bedroom and looked under the duvet. It was here that they finally found Min Lin's body. He too had met the same terrible end as his family. Robert, Kathy, Yang Fei Lin, and Feng Qingzhu were taken to hospital to be treated for shock. A short while later, Brenda, still away on her trip, decided to log into Facebook to catch up with things back home. Tragically, she learned what had happened to her family shortly after signing in. People began messaging her asking if she was okay, and sending her articles that showed pictures of her house. At first, she thought they were all playing some sort of sick joke, but her school arranged for her to travel back to Sydney on the first available flight. After landing, she was met with Kathy and police officers, who confirmed the horrific news. The last time Brenda had seen her family was when her father dropped her off a few days prior to begin her school excursion. Not wanting to draw attention to anything in front of her friends, she and her father awkwardly said goodbye and parted ways. Brenda said the Strike Force No Burn was a secret operation that was implemented to investigate the 5 murders, and pressure was on to solve a case that had become very high profile very quickly. The deaths of the Lin family started dominating the media, with all outlets keen to get the next scoop or lead on the case. It was initially reported that it may have been a murder-suicide, and the police said this was a possibility that was being investigated. Judging by the severe injuries sustained from the lengthy attacks, and the fact that the injuries were consistent across all 5 people in the house, this theory was quickly ruled out. Investigators noted several things about the crime scene. It appeared that whoever had gained access to the house knew the layout and was very comfortable with their surroundings. There were no signs of a break-in, and nothing appeared to have been ransacked or stolen. The power to the house had been cut from the outside. Police quickly determined that due to there being no signs of a forced entry, whoever the killer was most likely had a key to the property. 15-year-old Brenda's bedroom was completely untouched, and unlike the other bedrooms, which showed blood on all the door handles, her door handle was clean. This further fueled the police's theory that whoever had committed the crime knew the family and therefore knew Brenda was not there, deliberately avoiding that specific room. It was also determined that it was likely the killer had been wearing gloves, due to the way the blood was smeared and spread. Officers quickly concluded that there was only one perpetrator, and although there were 24 bloody footprints found, they were all the same size and make of shoe. The prints were between a US size 8.5 and a 10. The family were all so disfigured from the attacks that forensic analysis had to be used to formally identify them. It was determined that the murders had taken place between 2 and 5:30 a.m. Police believe that Min and Lily were killed first and Irene was killed after, before the killer went into the young boy's room last. Detectives concluded that the 2 young brothers most likely woke up after hearing their parents and aunt being killed. Experts also confirmed that due to the blood splatter analysis and the position the boys were found in on the floor, they had fought for their lives with everything they had. Henry was killed with 3 blows to the head. Terry was the only one not killed instantly and potentially stayed alive for up to 2 hours after the attack, which ultimately saw him struck 6 times. Blunt force trauma was listed as the cause of death, and with 4 out of the 5 victims, asphyxiation was also a contributing factor. A distinct pattern was visible on the family's faces, and a forensic pathologist determined that a hammer-like object with a rope around it was the murder weapon they were looking for. It was likely that the killer wrapped the rope around their wrist during the attacks. Over the following days, police brought Robert and Kathy in for interviews. Robert held his head in his hands through most of the interviews, crying and staring down at the table. Through his translator, he told the police that he and his wife Kathy had left hers in Min's parents' house the previous night. When they got back home, he'd watch sports before having a bath at around 2 a.m. After this, he headed to bed. 3 weeks after the family were killed, business at the Epping Central News Agency resumed. Kathy and Robert took over the ownership of the store and became Brenda's legal guardians. Robert offered to adopt Brenda a matter of hours after her parents were found. The funeral for the Lynn family was held in August. Hundreds of mourners turned up to pay their respects, including the children's school and the police looking after the investigation. The outpouring of grief was immense. A trust fund was set up to help Brenda with her future education, and the public came out in force to show their support for the family. As well as family and friends of the Lynns, the community wanted answers and justice too. Strike Force Nobun and the investigating team began to draw some conclusions. The lack of a break-in indicated the killer had a key, and the fact this person knew the layout of the house, including how to cut the power from the outside. The killer's knowledge that Brenda was not home, hence the reason her room was left undisturbed, and the shoe prints that covered the house, pointed to just one person. Robert the 000 call Kathy had made to authorities that morning also added more weight to this case. During the call, Kathy could be heard talking in Cantonese, begging Robert not to leave her alone in the house. For all anybody knew, the killer may still have been lying in wait somewhere, or may have potentially come back at any time. Robert left her for an hour to pick up her parents. Police concluded that only he would have known for definite that his wife was no longer in danger of meeting the same end as her family, hence the reason he left her. It was also alleged that when Kathy and Robert first went to the Lynn family home at 9 a.m. that morning, Robert told Kathy, "Don't look," before they could even see anything, indicating he already knew the scene that lay ahead. Police needed more before they could make an arrest. As Brenda was now living with Kathy and Robert, police set up pinhole surveillance cameras inside the couple's home. They had conducted a risk assessment to determine whether or not Robert posed any threat towards Brenda. and ultimately they determined he did not. Robert would have known Brenda's schedule, and therefore could have easily waited for her to come home before carrying out the murders. But he didn't. Further analysis of the Lynn's house found that the bloody shoe prints at the scene were from a make of a 6 trainer, the same trainers that Robert could be seen wearing in old photographs. Observing more from within Robert's and Kathy's home, police made another big link to the shoes in question. Robert was seen on one of the cameras talking to Kathy at the dining table. Whilst talking, he could be seen cutting a box into small pieces. He then soaked the pieces in a bucket before flushing them down the toilet. The box was an A6 trainer's shoe box, and the shoes in question were found out to be a men's US 9.5. Robert also made a curious phone call to a detective. He phoned to clarify something he may have said back when the Lynn family were discovered. He said he may have told a police officer at the scene that there were 5 bodies inside the house, but he claimed what he meant to say was that there were 4 or 5 bodies, and that he was phoning to clear this statement up. This only added more to the police's case. Although Min was the last to be found inside the house, police believed it was obvious that Robert knew exactly where he was, and had slipped up when he said 5 bodies during a time when the 5th victim couldn't be accounted for. It wasn't long before police began a thorough search of Robert and Kathy's home, and seized Robert's car. The couple had both confirmed in previous interviews that on the morning the family were discovered, they had both been up early. Robert told the police he had spent the morning in his garage. Knowing this, police were keen to search that particular space. During the search of the garage, a stain was found on the floor, and this was labeled up as stain number 91. Experts believe this was a transfer stain, and it contained a mixture of DNA. It was quickly sent away for testing. After the results came back, it was concluded that stain 91 contained DNA from 4 out of the 5 victims. It matched 9-year-old Terry with a 1 in 50 quadrillion chance of the DNA belonging to anyone else. Following this huge discovery, at 9 a.m. on May 5, 2011, Robert Z. was arrested for the murder of his extended family. He applied for bail, but this was denied. Although Kathy had confirmed Robert's alibi for that night, saying he didn't leave their bed, it is believed that Robert sedated her before leaving early that morning, sometime after 2 a.m. He then headed over to the Lynn's house with a key that had been cut. It was also concluded that Robert killed each member of the family in the order in which they presented a threat for resistance or detention. It is thought that the 2 boys and Irene were collateral damage or secondary victims, who may have woken up when Min and Lily were being killed. Police phoned Brenda's school, and she was quickly pulled into the principal's office and told the news about her uncle's arrest. Brenda's principal, Susan, said she herself had become suspicious of Robert when she witnessed him reducing Brenda to tears in the schoolyard. She said he was so physically close to her, speaking loudly, rapidly in Chinese. Brenda with her head down, tears falling down. It was clear that he was trying to get her to agree to something. I told my husband, I think I've just spent all day with a murderer. I just got a gut feeling he was dangerous, and I was very worried for Brenda's safety. Susan was so concerned that she eventually persuaded Brenda to obtain a lawyer. Brenda's lawyer soon began to suspect Robert as well. At this time, Brenda did not think it was possible that her uncle could have ever been involved. For a lot of people, the motive remained unclear. It was initially thought that Robert's motive stemmed from nothing more than jealousy and greed. Since coming to Sydney, he had been virtually unemployed after a restaurant venture he had failed. Police also found no evidence to suggest that he was actually an ear, nose, and throat specialist back in China. His brother-in-law, Min, was a successful businessman by this point, and police believe that Robert's jealousy of Min consumed him. Robert believed he was entitled to respect and admiration from his extended family, but felt he was denied it because of the attention given to Min. 3.5 years on from the Lynn murders, the brother-in-law of one of the victims has been ordered to stand trial. In December 2012, Robert was committed to stand trial. Some of the DNA evidence was still in the process of being tested, and the trial was delayed and pushed back. But in May 2014, the trial of Robert Z. began. He pled not guilty. Since July 2011, Robert had been sharing details with a fellow inmate who subsequently reported this back to police. The informant took the stand to testify against Robert in exchange for a reduced sentence. The inmate, known as Witness A, said that Robert had told him he had bought a hammer, which was the murder weapon, from a $2 shop, as he knew the CCTV cameras in the shop were fake. He also alleged that Robert had said he'd planned to steal a dead man's DNA from a funeral home and plant it on the murder weapon. Witnesses said Robert told him that on the night of the murder, he had sedated Kathy before leaving the house. Despite witnesses pushing Robert to find out where the murder weapon was, to this day it has never been located. It is thought that on the morning Robert drove to pick up Yang Fei Lin and Feng Qingzhu, he took the murder weapon with him and disposed of it along the way. Robert's defense team stated that it would have been impossible for one person to commit all 5 murders and escape unharmed. They also argued that Robert was not the only person living in Australia that wore size 9.5 A6 trainers. They stated that there was potentially 3 different sets of shoe prints at the crime scene, not just one. During the trial, Brenda, who was faced with all of the evidence against her uncle, said she finally had to accept the reality of what he had done to her family. Brenda's identity was kept hidden during the trials. She spoke to her lawyer and gave him evidence that added even more to an already shocking story. She told her lawyer and later the New South Wales Supreme Court that Robert had sexually assaulted her on a number of occasions before the murders. After she moved in with him and Kathy, the assaults began to escalate. The Lin family estate, which likely would have gone to Brenda, was now being controlled by Robert and Kathy, and Robert evicted Min and Kathy's parents from the home that Min had bought for them. This added more weight to the theory that he was so fixated with Brenda. He did everything in his power to make sure she would be left with no choice but to move in with him and Kathy. While observing the family through pinhole cameras, police did observe Robert touching Brenda in what they called an uncomfortable way, but police said the touching they observed didn't amount to molestation. Brenda's grandfather Yang Fei Lin told the court that he had seen Robert staring into Brenda's bedroom during the early hours one morning. The juries in all of the trials knew Brenda's evidence, but journalists could not publish anything that identified her. She was referred to as Miss AB. After Brenda told the courtroom about the abuse she had suffered, she said that her Aunt Kathy began sending Brenda messages, proclaiming that Robert had been framed by the police and that everyone had it all wrong. Brenda spoke of how disappointed she was in Kathy's reaction. After the accounts of sexual abuse were brought to light in the courtroom, Justice Johnson declared a mistrial. A new trial had to be set for August 2014. On the first day of the second trial, the prosecution presented a new theory behind Robert's motive. As well as his jealousy of Min, he evidently had a disturbing sexual obsession with Min's daughter Brenda. But unfortunately, not long into the second trial, Justice Peter Johnson fell ill, and the trial again was postponed. 6 months later, in February 2015, Robert's third trial began. Justice Elizabeth Fullerton was now presiding, and the trial went on to last for 10 months. The jury took 19 days to deliberate. However, they could not reach a unanimous verdict, and it was again declared a mistrial. Justice Fullerton granted Robert bail while he awaited his next trial. After almost 5 years behind bars without a conviction, he was fitted with an electronic monitor and allowed back home. In June 2016, the fourth and what would be the final trial began. With Justice Fullerton still presiding, and 8 months later, in February 2017, the jury had reached their verdict. Robert was found guilty by a majority verdict of 11-1. Kathy and Min's parents said they were happy with the verdict they had waited so long for. Justice Fullerton said of Brenda, "I acknowledge the profound grief she has suffered and continues to suffer. While the law does not permit a sentencing judge to take into account any additional because a family member of a murder victim has suffered through their death. In this case, the far-reaching and immeasurable harm done is also an aspect of the harm done to the community, and for that reason, I also take that into account when imposing life sentences in this case." Robert was given 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. It would be years before the suppression order that concealed Brenda's identity was when she agreed to appear in an exclusive interview with Channel 7. Robert's wife Kathy still believes he is innocent and said that he is a caring man who would never hurt the family. Kathy and Min's parents, however, agree with the rulings and believe that Robert is now where he belongs, saying, "He is not a human being. He is a monster." Robert appealed his sentences in June 2020, but in 2021, after just 10 minutes at the New South Wales Criminal Appeals Court, 3 judges dismissed his appeal. In her interviews, Brenda Lynn said she is still trying to rebuild her life as best she can. She credits her amazing family with making her the person she is today, and she said she is forever grateful for how the community came together to help her. She wants to make sure she carries on doing all the things she knows her family would have wanted her to do, and said she hopes in the future she is able to do something to help other people and give back to everyone that supported her. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. On June 17, 1924, Archibald Thompson Hall was born on Ibrox Road in Glasgow, Scotland. His early years were difficult, marked by social exclusion and a fragmented childhood. He struggled to make friends and often skipped school, spending time watching variety shows instead. Inspired by the admiration these performers received, he aimed to rise above his working-class upbringing and turbulent home life. In his teens, he began getting into trouble with the law and was noticed by the police from as young as 15 years old. Hall was also bisexual, and his marriage ended shortly after it began. In the late 1940s, Hall left Scotland and traveled south to England. London was still under rationing, as was the rest of the country, and the rebuilding of the city wouldn't fully get underway until the 1950s. Hall traveled to Soho and soon became a firm fixture in the nightclubs. During that time, not only was homosexuality illegal, but members of the LGBTQ+ community were treated appallingly by both police and society in general. The London club scene, however, was more open. During that time, various gangs controlled different parts of the city, and this gave Hall an insight into London's criminal underworld, a life he was desperate to be a part of. His love of performing made him a consummate conman, and he soon began committing theft. Between 1945 and 1977, Hall had spent more time inside prison than out of it. Alongside his love of variety shows, cinema was another fixation for Hall. Upon his release from prison, he began using the name Roy Fontaine, named after legendary actress Joan Fontaine, after he saw her in Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca. He would confidently pose as an aristocrat or a wealthy American, and quickly perfected his skills as a conman and thief. He would introduce himself as Dr. Roy Fontaine to gain people's trust, and according to one report, he was jailed in the 1970s for selling secret papers to the Russians. In a letter, Hall explained that this was a miscarriage of justice, and that he was an innocent man. On one occasion, he stole the invitation meant for his employer and impersonated him at a party at Holyrood House in Edinburgh. As he began to move up the social circles, he got a job as a butler in Dumfries, Scotland, working for Lady Margaret Hudson. Lady Hudson was the widow of Sir Austin Hudson, a former Conservative Member of Parliament. Hall made a good impression with those in the community, and he was described as polite and incredibly well-mannered. In 1977, one of Hall's former lovers arrived in Dumfries, throwing Hall's life into chaos. David Wright had shared a cell with Archibald Hall when they were both serving time in Hall prison together. The pair had a sexual relationship, and Wright's presence in Dumfries was a major threat to Hall. David Wright was given a job as a gamekeeper and began doing odd jobs throughout the house. He knew too much about Hall and his past and threatened to reveal this to Lady Hudson. Wright also began to steal from the house, leaving Hall enraged. Wright stole some of the antique silver and a ring, but Archibald Hall told him he needed to return it, and this quickly sparked an explosive row. As the argument escalated, David attempted to shoot Archibald, but missed. In an attempt to defuse the situation, Hall plied Wright with alcohol before the pair slept together. Although the argument appeared to be over, Hall had made his mind up. David Wright had to die. The next morning, they decided to go rabbit hunting on the grounds. Before they left, Hall ensured that Wright's gun was not loaded. David Wright remarked what a lovely day it was. Hall, ever the performer, allegedly replied, "Lovely day. Shame this is the last day you will see." He then pulled his gun up and shot David Wright in the head. Archibald Hall had gone from a thief and conman to a cold-blooded killer. He buried Wright next to the river that ran through the grounds. When he would take Lady Hudson's dog for a walk, each time he would put more stones on where he had buried the body, so that the dog couldn't smell it. Hall told Lady Hudson that Wright had left suddenly due to being offered a job elsewhere. Soon after, Hall headed back to London. Lady Hudson was none the wiser about the sinister goings-on and gave him a glowing reference to help him secure his next job. In October 1977, he got a job as a butler for Walter and Dorothy Scott Elliott. Walter Scott Elliott was 82 years old and had served as the Labour MP for Accrington between 1945 and 1950. He was from an aristocratic Scottish background, and his wife Dorothy was also incredibly wealthy. The pair lived at 200 Sloane Street in the prominent and affluent area of Knightsbridge, West London. Like Lady Hudson, the Scott Elliots found him to be affable, polite, and developed a real fondness for him. Being part of their household gave Archibald Hall the opportunity to case nearby properties and seamlessly move about in their social circles. He intended to rob his elderly wealthy employers, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He made contact with his former lover, an Irish woman named Mary Cogle, and asked if she knew anyone that could help him pull it off. She arranged a meeting, and in November 1977, at a pub in King's Cross, she introduced 53-year-old Archibald Hall to 39-year-old Michael Kiddo. Like Archibald Hall, Michael Kiddo had an unstable childhood, and he also spent time in the foster care system. After moving around a lot, he ended up in the armed forces, but he was dishonorably discharged after committing a robbery. Kiddo had 2 failed marriages and a daughter, and with no stable address, he moved around the country often. He would take on odd jobs where he could find them in an attempt to support himself. He had many run-ins with the law and was frequently in front of judges for committing petty offenses. Despite his long rap sheet, this wasn't the experienced accomplice that Archibald Hall had been looking for. But for Kiddo, this was the perfect opportunity to make some big money. Money that was unprecedented for him. When they met, Kiddo was on the run after robbing the pub he had worked at as a barman. The crimes that Hall was talking about were a huge step up from the petty offenses that Kiddo had committed thus far. The dynamic between the pair was instant. Hall was in charge, and Kiddo did what he was told to do. Kiddo greatly admired Hall and was hugely flattered that he had been asked to help him in his criminal endeavors. After committing several robberies in the local area, they set about devising a plan to rob Walter and Dorothy Scott Elliott. They would steal little and often, in the hopes that the vulnerable elderly couple wouldn't realize. This plan, however, quickly and rather spectacularly fell apart. In December 1977, less than a month after they had first met, Dorothy Scott Elliott walked in on Hall and Kiddo discussing their plans and what could be stolen from the home. Kiddo had no right to be in the house, and it appeared that their crimes were about to come to an abrupt end. In reality, they were about to escalate in the most appalling way imaginable. They both immediately decided that she had to be killed. Dorothy Scott Elliott was smothered to death while her beloved husband Walter was asleep upstairs. In murdering Dorothy, they had killed a popular socialite in the busy UK capital, someone whose disappearance would not go unnoticed. They knew they had to leave and leave quickly. They moved her body to the boot of their car before drugging Walter and driving to Scotland. So as not to draw attention to themselves, Mary Cogle dressed up as the deceased Dorothy Scott Elliott. According to the Daily Record, they convinced the confused and semi-conscious Walter to allow them to drive him to various banks, withdrawing huge sums of money. After traveling 400 miles, they reached Braco in Perthshire. After they pulled into a quiet road, they removed the body of Dorothy Scott Elliott and buried her. Walter was still under the influence of the drugs they had given him, and after burying Dorothy, they carried on driving. They took him to an isolated spot in Inverness. He was taken out of the car and strangled with a scarf. Believing he was dead, Hall and Kiddo walked back to the car, but they began to hear a groaning sound coming from where they had left Walter's body. He was still alive. According to Hall, he sent Kiddo back with a shovel and told him to finish the job. Walter Scott Elliott was then beaten to death. 3 people were now dead, and the crime spree showed no signs of stopping. But the trio soon ran into problems. Mary Cogle insisted on continuing to wear Dorothy's distinctive fur coat, as well as her jewelry, which started to bring them unwanted attention. Desperate to escape, they headed to Cumbria and arrived in the small village of Newton Arlosh. They began to rent a cottage nearby, and Quito and Hall became regulars at the local pub while they attempted to lie low. Unbeknownst to the residents of this sleepy English village, two brutal murderers and their accomplice were now living in their midst. Hall told local residents that he was an antique dealer, another part of the web of lies he was spinning. During their time at the cottage, they had made several trips back to where the Scott Elliots had lived to sell off more of their antiques. They told the Scott Elliots caretaker that the couple had gone abroad unexpectedly. A few weeks later, on Christmas Day in 1977, a shepherd was walking down by the stream that ran past the village. It was here that he made a horrific discovery. He found the body of a woman lying in the water. She had suffered appalling head injuries and had seemingly died a very violent death. It soon became clear who it was. It was Mary Coggle. As the investigation into her murder got underway, a few weeks later in January 1978, Hall contacted the mother of an old associate and asked if he and Quito could stay for the night. They headed off to East Lothian, but due to a snowstorm, they had to stop mid-journey. On the night of the 16th of January, they arrived in North Berwick and booked a room at the Blenheim House Hotel. Norman Wright, who was the owner of the hotel at the time, said there was something about the pair he immediately didn't like. Listening to his instincts, he called the police, as he thought they had fled from another hotel and not paid the bill, and he was worried they might do the same to him. The police arrived and checked the tax disc on the car. The tax disc didn't match the number plate. When the police said they wanted to speak to Quito and Hall, Norman Wright said they were extremely calm and willing to talk to the officers. It was reported in the Watford Observer that Hall had the number plate changed, as the original one had 999 on it, the UK emergency code, which Hall didn't appreciate. The detectives then took them down to the station to answer questions. Officers described them as calm and collected, with Quito being quiet and Hall doing all the talking. Hall was also confident in answering the officers' questions. During their interviews, he made regular trips to the bathroom, and on one of those trips, he escaped out the window and fled the station. Officers from CID came to remove the car, and upon seizing it, the duty inspector made a terrifying discovery. In the boot of the car was the body of a naked man. This had gone from a petty driving offense to a major murder investigation, but one of their killers had just escaped. Archibald's flashy style ultimately caught up with him. He was immediately recognizable as he was smartly dressed, with a red and white polka dot handkerchief in his breast pocket. And later that night, he was caught as part of a road check in nearby Wallaford. Finally, Archibald Hall was back in custody. When he was back at the station, he allegedly swallowed pills that he had concealed and subsequently collapsed. He was taken to hospital and later discharged back into the custody of officers. He was initially arrested for handling stolen items, giving police more time to build a case against him for murder. It wasn't long before he started talking, and officers could not believe what they were hearing. In the case of Dorothy Scott Elliott, both men began to blame each other. But what had happened to the woman who had bought Hall and Quito together? What had happened to Mary Coggle? In his statement, Hall had said that an argument had broken out about her refusal to part with Coggle was drawing and wanted attention to them, while Hall was desperate for them to fly under the radar. He explained that during an argument near the river, she had fallen off the bridge, cracked her head open and died, but scientific analysis said otherwise. Officers believed that what had actually happened was far more deliberate. They believed that the argument had began at the cottage they were staying in and that Mary Coggle had been beaten with a fire poker and then suffocated with a plastic bag. At the cottage, police also found bloodstains and fingerprints that matched Mary Coggle. They also found linen that had the crest of the Scott Elliots on it. The men then drove her body to the river and threw it over the bridge. Then came another question. Who was the man in the boot of their car? And why had he been murdered? The final victim was not a stranger to them. He was Archibald's half-brother Donald. It is believed that after Mary had been murdered and before they fled to Scotland, they arrived back at their cottage and found Donald waiting for them. Donald was a pedophile who had just been released from prison. Despite being related, the pair had an extremely fraught relationship and there was no love lost between the two of them. They told Donald that he could be part of their next job, which would include tying up their victims. Donald was persuaded to let them practice on him. Once he was restrained and unable to move, Hall used chloroform to render him immobile. Archibald Hall then drowned Donald in the bathtub. On the 16th of January, 1978, the pair put Donald's body in the boot of their car and headed north toward Scotland. But why had he murdered his brother? According to Archibald's lawyer, the one person he cared about was his daughter, Caroline. As his brother was a pedophile, his lawyer said he likely had killed him to protect her, although this has been called into question. He didn't regularly see his daughter, and she was barely mentioned in his later written autobiography. In his confession, he remarked how surprised he had been with Walter Scott Elliott's strength. During their interviews, it also became clear that Kiddo had, ironically, had a very lucky escape in being arrested. Hall had no loyalty to him and saw him as dispensable. Kiddo was likely going to be the next victim, as Archibald had planned to murder him too. When talking about why he had committed his appalling crimes, Hall's defense was staggering. He blamed Michael Kiddo for starting him off again on a career of crime and said it was all his fault. He also made a second attempt to take his own life. While in hospital, he finally confessed to officers about his very first murder. He went on to explain how he had brutally killed David Wright. Archibald Hall eventually confessed to the murders and led the police to the bodies of his victims. As the murders had taken place in both Scotland and England, trials had to be held in both countries. The case for the murders committed in Scotland went to the High Court in Edinburgh on Kiddo's 40th birthday. The confident and performative Hall was unusually silent. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Unchanged Kiddo turned to the press bench and said, "Kiddo was convicted of the murders of Mary Cogle and Walter Scott Elliott, and the manslaughters of Dorothy Scott Elliott and Donald Hall. Hall was convicted at courts in both London and Edinburgh of 4 murders. The murder of Dorothy Scott Elliott was ordered to lie on file, meaning that a judge acknowledged there was enough evidence to make a case, but it wasn't in the public interest to proceed, normally because the accused has acknowledged more serious offenses. In the summer of 1978, Hall was given 2 life sentences for the murder of Wright and Walter Scott Elliott at the High Court in Edinburgh. He was later given 2 more life sentences for the murders of Cogle and Donald Hall at the Old Bailey. In 1999, Hall wrote an autobiography called A Perfect Gentleman detailing his life and crimes. He stated in the book, he went on to cooperate in writing several other books too, including To Kill and Kill Again, The Chilling True Confessions of a Serial Killer, and The Wicked Mr. Hall. A film about his life was also due to be released, with acclaimed actor Malcolm McDowell starring as the titular monster butler, but the film was cancelled due to lack of funding. While in prison, Hall went on hunger strike several times and spoke of not wanting to grow old in his cell. On September 16, 2002, while serving his sentence, Archibald Hall died at HMP Kingston. A spokesman for the coroner's office said that Hall had died of natural causes. He was 78 years old. At the time of his death, he was the oldest prisoner serving a whole life sentence. Kiddo was eventually released, and his whereabouts are unknown to the public. The crimes of Archibald Hall were shocking, calculated, and cruel. 5 people lost their lives due to greed and ruthlessness, and many more fell victim to the consummate conman's lies. The chance checking of the tax disc had brought to an end an extraordinary chain of events that had left a trail of chaos and destruction. If they hadn't have been stopped, one can only speculate about how many more may have fallen victim. In the early hours of October 28, 1994, a newspaper delivery person from the Seattle Times began their route in Renton, King County, Washington. Around 3:30 a.m., they noticed something unusual on a small dead-end road surrounded by trees. There was a vehicle with its doors open, and nearby, they found the bodies of a young woman and a child lying on the road. They immediately called 911. When officers arrived, they identified the woman as 23-year-old Stacy Falcon Dewey. The child was later identified as her 3-year-old son, Jacob Dewey. Both had multiple gunshot wounds, which was the cause of their death. Initially, it was thought to have been a robbery gone wrong. The contents of Stacy's purse had been strewn both inside and outside of her '84 Buick Century, but further evidence suggested that there may have been a darker motive behind the crime. Packing tape that appeared to have been used to bind Stacy was found on the passenger side of the vehicle. Stacy's belt was undone and several buttons from her shirt were found in the vehicle. The medical examiner also suggested that Jacob may have been killed facing Stacy, or she might have been holding him when he was killed. The two fatal shots that had killed Jacob had gone through his body and hit Stacy in the arm and shoulder. Then she was killed with 2 shots to the back of the head. Stacy had been covered in bruises, including around her neck and a significant head wound from what was assumed to have been a blow from the back of the gun. Stacy's clothing had also been caked with mud, whereas Jacob had been completely clean, indicating that she might have tried to run away before being wrestled back into the car. The bodies were moved into the middle of the road, and it was presumed the killer had intended to drive off in the car, but the keys had fallen between the driver's door and the seat and had only been found when the seats had been fully removed. Officers suspected that when the killer couldn't find the keys, he then fled on foot away from the crime scene. Neighbors who lived in the area reported hearing gunshots at around 2:10 a.m., giving law enforcement an estimated time of the death of the 2 victims. Earlier that evening, Stacy had dropped Jacob off with a babysitter, a friend who lived in an apartment complex that Stacy had recently moved out of. Stacy and Jacob had recently moved into an apartment 4 miles away, and she lived with her boyfriend. Jacob was with a babysitter because Stacy was going out to celebrate her birthday with and had returned to pick up her son around 1:45 a.m. Witnesses said they saw her get into her vehicle and drive off, and it should have been a short journey home, only a few minutes drive away. Her boyfriend was reported to have been at home at the time of the murders, and he had expected them to return, but he didn't notice they hadn't until officers knocked on the door because he'd fallen asleep. Officers extensively investigated the brutal murders for several years. Several suspects had been ruled out, which had included Stacy's boyfriend and ex-husband, but eventually the case went cold. In 2001, several advances in DNA technology had been made, and it was this case that was reopened to look at for new leads. That year, several samples that had been collected from the autopsy were tested for DNA, and they found male DNA under her fingernails. In 2002, the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab got a match from the incarcerated inmate, Jerome Frank Jones, who was in federal prison in California for a murder he committed in 1995. They flew to California to interview him, who, when shown photos of Stacy, denied having known her. In 2002, they also interviewed the building manager of Stacy's old apartment, the one that her friend had lived in, and he confirmed that a man named Jerome Jones lived there in 1994. No other connection between Stacy and Jones was found, and in 2002, due to what was described as delays, budget cuts, and other procedural hiccups, the case fell between the cracks for nearly a decade. A podcast highlighted the case in 2019, and it was only because of that coverage that the family had been alerted of the DNA connection when they hadn't known about it before. They then pushed law enforcement to answer why that evidence hadn't produced an arrest. In 2021, the case was officially reopened. Several more advances in DNA had occurred since 2002, and investigators wanted to see if there was anything else from that crime scene that could be new for the case. In December 2021, additional DNA evidence was found, this time on the sleeve of Jacob's coat. This DNA connected Jerome Jones directly to the crime scene. On February 18, 2022, the now 51-year-old Jerome Jones was charged in the 1994 murder of Stacy Falcon Dewey, as well as the murder of Jacob Dewey. He has also been charged with robbery and sexual assault. Jones had been scheduled for release in 2030 from his previous convictions, but if convicted of these charges, he will likely be sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. 26 years after Patricia Barnes, a 61-year-old Seattle, Washington resident's body was discovered in Olalla, Washington. Her case has been solved thanks to the advanced DNA testing. In 1995, Patricia Barnes was last seen by acquaintances 3 days before her body was discovered in a ditch. She was found nude in a sleeping bag with several gunshot wounds to her head. Her social circle was very small, which made the case more difficult to solve. During the investigation, the Kitsap County detectives collected and documented over 130 pieces of evidence. The evidence included the sleeping bag, evidence from her body, and cigarette butts found at the crime scene. However, after a large amount of follow-up, they could not identify a suspect. For some time, it was suspected that Patricia was the victim of Robert Lee Yates, also known as the Spokane serial murderer, even though her profile did not match those of Yates' previous victims. Detectives later proved that Yates was stationed in Alabama at the time of Patricia's murder, eliminating him as a suspect. In 2018, the Kitsap County Sheriff's Office reopened Patricia's case. According to an interview with Detective Mike Grant, he and another detective decided to submit evidence they felt would be significant to finding the murderer to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. The crime lab developed an unknown male profile using the evidence submitted, which would be the first solid break in the case in decades. However, there was no match after entering the DNA profile into Cody's. Yet another roadblock in the case, but the detectives were determined to find justice for Patricia Barnes. With the help of the Attorney General's office, the detectives were given several private labs to submit the evidence to for processing. One of those labs was Ortham Labs out of the Woodlands, Texas. Scientists were able to build a male genetic profile. According to Detective Grant, Ortham Labs had identified a first or second cousin, which led them to a name, Douglas Keith Crone. Detectives tracked Crone to Nogales, Arizona, in 2016 and learned that Crone had died at his home during an electrical accident. The Pima County Medical Examiner conducted an autopsy and sent blood samples to detectives in Kitsap County. They then in turn sent them to the state crime lab for DNA testing. 2 weeks later, they confirmed that Douglas Crone's DNA matched evidence collected from the crime scene, using a cigarette but left at the scene, and it was concluded that Crone had been the killer. Mary London was a sweet and friendly 17-year-old teenager who lived in Sacramento, California. She was a sophomore at the local high school, and her family described her as being developmentally disabled. On January 14, 1981, Mary was reported missing by her family after she wasn't on her scheduled bus ride to the Sacramento High School. The following day, Mary's body was found by a passerby on a stretch of the San Juan. She was stabbed several times and sexually assaulted. According to Mary's friends and family, Mary grew up in foster care. Her daily routine was the same every week. Detectives determined that she was in school the day before she went missing. After school, Mary went to a friend's house. The friend told detectives that Mary had left her home to go and visit someone in downtown Sacramento. That friend saw her get on a city bus. Detectives also had a witness who saw Mary get off the bus in downtown Sacramento at 8th and K Streets. This was the last confirmed sighting of Mary. In the 1980s, there wasn't technology like we have today. Detectives talked to everyone who knew Mary and collected evidence carefully from the scene, including DNA from Mary's body. When DNA procedures advanced, the DNA collected from the crime scene was resubmitted in the early 2000s to try and find a match for a suspect. Unfortunately, there were no DNA matches in Cody's, so the case went cold again. After 35 years, the case was reopened in 2016 by the Sacramento Police Department detectives. According to a posting on their Facebook page, the detectives were asking for community to help in finding a man named Daryl. He was a known friend of Mary's, however. He was not considered a suspect at the time. After submitting his DNA to Cody's, it was determined that Daryl did not murder Mary. 40 years after Mary's murder, detectives announced that they had found who murdered Mary. Detectives named Vernon Parker as Mary's killer. They had identified him using genetic genealogy and advanced DNA practices. Detectives learned during their investigation that Parker was involved in sex trafficking and a prostitution ring. According to detectives, Parker had been murdered in downtown Sacramento, about a block from where Mary had went missing, and they knew that was not a coincidence as he was known to hang out in that area. While justice cannot be served, the determination and persistence of the Sacramento Police Department have given Mary's family closure. On February 21, 1987, a couple walked into a Super 8 motel in Elizabethtown, Kentucky at 6:30 a.m. to check out. They immediately noticed something amiss. The telephone had been ripped from the wall. There were desk items strewn about the small office, and there was no sign of any staff members. They returned to their room and called 911 at 6:38 a.m. An officer arrived and confirmed that the scene did look like something had happened. He described it as looking as if a brawl between a large group of people had occurred. The officer called for backup when he couldn't immediately find the missing staff person. More officers arrived and began searching the property. It wasn't long before they found 41-year-old Vicky Heath, who had been the only employee on the property for the overnight shift. She had been sexually assaulted and had been shot twice in the back of the head. It had appeared that Vicky fought to the very end. The struggle appeared to have started in the lobby and made its way all the way out to the back of the building near the dumpsters and had passed that. Her clothing had been ripped and the mud and grass around her body had been disturbed, with one set of muddy footprints that went from Vicky's body to the parking lot at the front of the building. Vicky was new to the job and new to Elizabethtown. The recently divorced woman had 2 adult children and she was starting over. A manager had left Vicky that night around 11 p.m. Though it had been a Saturday night, it was still the off-season and the motel still wasn't very busy. All had seemed normal. There were no guests that had seemed of any concern, nor had anything happened recently that drew any cause for concern for Vicky or anyone else. Despite what seemed to have been a huge commotion, none of the patrons that night heard anything. Officers also noted that an undisclosed sum of money had been stolen that night as well, and theorized that the crime had been a robbery gone wrong. It had been a shocking murder in the community. Officers never established any suspects and the case quickly went cold. 2 years later, another similar murder occurred in Marydale, Indiana. Mary Margaret Gill, known to friends and family as Peggy, spent the evening with her father, as it was his birthday, on the evening of March 2, 1989, before heading out to work the night shift at the local Marydale Days Inn. Little did Peggy's father know that his birthday would be the worst day of his life the following day. Peggy arrived for her shift at the Days Inn at 11 p.m., as she did every time before she started her shift. Hotel records showed that Peggy checked in at guests between the hours of 1:30 a.m. and 1:40 a.m. A witness told police that he attempted to check in the hotel at 2 a.m., but no clerk was found, so he left. This time frame leads police to believe that between 1:30 a.m. and 2 a.m. is when the crime occurred. 5 a.m. rolled around and Peggy was supposed to call the general manager, Betty, before leaving the hotel. This call had become routine because of the recent crimes at the local hotels. Minutes after not receiving the call from Peggy, Betty decided to try and make contact with Peggy and called the hotel. When Peggy did not immediately answer, she knew something was wrong and called the police. The Maryvale Police Department was dispatched immediately. The first officer arrived at the hotel around 6 a.m. Upon his arrival, several guests were waiting to check out, but no clerk was in sight, which was unusual. After finding Peggy's car keys and wallet behind the desk, the police decided to reach out to Peggy's family to see if she was with them or if they had heard from her. Her family informed the officer that she was not with them, nor had they heard from Peggy. Meanwhile, the general manager, Betty, arrived on the scene. She discovered the cash drawer appeared to have been pried open and that money was missing. The officers began to search for Peggy and made a gruesome discovery. Peggy's body was found in a hotel hallway in a vacant wing where all the rooms were empty. One of the unusual things that the police officers noticed was that Peggy's clothing had been removed and folded neatly and placed beside her naked body. It was determined that Peggy had been sexually assaulted and shot in the head with a .22 caliber firearm. She also had a fresh cut on her shoulder. It did not appear to be a violent struggle based on the evidence observed on Peggy's body. They theorized based on the evidence that the suspect robbed Peggy, directed her to the vacant hallway at gunpoint. He forced her to take her clothes, fold them and lay them beside her on the ground. It was then that he attacked her and killed her. Family members and members of Peggy's social circle were questioned. It was then determined that Peggy did not know her salient. In a shocking discovery, an hour later, a similar crime occurred an hour away from Maryville in Remington, Indiana. The victim, Jean Marie Gilbert, was born and raised in Rensselaer, Indiana. She was a single mom, recently divorced with 2 children, Kimberly and Scott. Jean and her children had moved in with her mother while Jean was attending school and working several jobs to provide a better life for her children. Jean worked at the Days Inn to supplement her income. The Days Inn was located in the small town of Remington, right outside Rensselaer, a small rural town very similar to Maryville, Indiana, where Peggy's murder had occurred. Jean was taking business classes to obtain a career where she could support her children. On March 2nd, 1989, Jean switched shifts with a coworker because she needed to attend her daughter's final cheerleading event the next day. The shift started at 11 p.m. It is important to note that the Remington days in where Jean worked was only 50 miles away from the Maryville days in where Peggy worked. Both hotels were in the middle of nowhere and both were in rural towns. Based on hotel records and witness accounts on Friday, March 3rd, Jean made a courtesy wake-up call to a guest at around 4:30 a.m. Then around 6 a.m., the Jasper County Sheriff's Office began receiving calls from guests trying to check out but could not find the hotel clerk. Officers were dispatched to the scene where, upon arrival, they discovered that the hotel lobby door was locked. The police then reached out to the hotel's general manager and asked her to come down and give them access to the lobby. A hotel employee was also waiting to get in to start her shift. Officers eventually gained access to the Remington Days Inn and discovered that there had been a robbery. The cash drawer appeared to have been pried open and the money was missing. Not only that, but the hotel employee, Jean, was also missing. Like the Maryville, Indiana crime scene, officers find Jean's purse, keys, and school books at the desk. While all of this is happening, the Indiana State Police were contacted by a school bus driver in White County, which was not far from the Days Inn. The bus driver had spotted a nude body on the side of a county road. Indiana State Troopers and the White County Sheriff's Department were dispatched to the scene. There they found the body of a woman only wearing her shoes and socks. It appeared that she had been sexually assaulted and dumped on the roadside. Not long after the remains were found, they were able to quickly identify that the remains were that of Jane Marie Gilbert. Interestingly, her Days Inn uniform that she had been wearing that evening was missing and had not been recovered at the crime scene or where her body was. The investigation would be conducted by the Indiana State Police, who found Jane's body, and the Jasper County Sheriff's Office, who were investigating the robbery at the Remington Days Inn. Police believe the suspect, after robbing their hotel, led Jane to the car at gunpoint where he drove her to where her body was found. The exit off of Interstate 65 where Jean's body was found was isolated with no gas stations, restaurants, or hotels, and completely deserted. And she was attacked and killed in that clearing near where her body was found. Jean's autopsy revealed that she had several scratches and scrapes on her body. Those wounds would indicate that she'd been dragged from the vehicle. Jean was shot 3 times with the .22 caliber firearm. Once in the back of the head, once in the shoulder blade, and once on the left side of her torso. A witness, a farmer who lived in the area, told police that he'd heard gunshots around 5:30 a.m. This was around the same time that the bus driver stated they saw a tan-colored Toyota van with its lights on, heading westbound on the same road where Jean's body was found. Police began to put 2 and 2 together and realized that the Maryville crime scene was extremely similar to the Remington crime scene. The only difference was that Jane was taken from the hotel where Peggy was killed on site. And just like in Vicky's case, there were no suspects and eventually the case went cold. Tianda and Diamond Bradley were born to Tracy Bradley and lived in an apartment in Bronzeville, Chicago, Illinois. Diamond's father was reportedly a man named George Washington, with whom Tracy had an intermittent relationship and paternity dispute. Tianda's father's identity was never confirmed. Tracy Bradley was a single mother raising 4 daughters, and her family provided consistent support by babysitting and helping her raise her children. As well as her family, there was a neighbor and good friend of Tracy, who lived in the same building, and he supported her too. His name was also George. George Sr. 10-year-old Tianda was described by one of her sisters as very outspoken and honest around her family, someone that had a strong sense of right and wrong, and was very intelligent for her age. Around people she didn't know, however, she was much more reserved. Tianda loved nothing more than riding her bike, dancing and gymnastics, putting herself up to be in every school talent show. Younger sister Diamond was 3. She followed her older sister Tianda and mother around everywhere. Her sister Rita said she would jump from couch to couch and had bundles of energy. Tianda was fiercely protective of her little sister, and the pair had a very close relationship. On July 5, 2001, Tianda and Diamond's other 2 sisters, Rita and Victoria, left the apartment to stay with their grandmother for the night. Tracy stayed home with Tianda and Diamond. Allegedly, also at the apartment was Washington, who spent the night there too. They had all been planning a camping trip and were set to celebrate Victoria's birthday in a couple of days. The following morning, July 6th, according to Tracy, she awoke before 6 a.m., kissed both of her girls goodbye before leaving for work at Robert Taylor Park, where she prepared lunches for children in a summer program. She said she left the apartment secure and locked, and Tianda was asked to watch over Diamond, and as always was given strict instructions not to open the door to anybody. Washington also left with Tracy and dropped her off at work. Most reports state that Tracy and Washington left the apartment at around 6:30 a.m. Tracy used a phone at work to call the apartment sometime between 7 and 8 a.m., but the call went unanswered. She said she was concerned, but told herself her girls must have fallen back to sleep. When Tracy's shift finished just before noon, she returned to the apartment with Washington again after he had picked her up. She called out her daughter's names, but got no response. Tracy panicked and asked Washington to help her look for the girls, but he left and drove away in his car. A small pile of clothes was left on the couch, alongside a handwritten note. It was written by 10-year-old Tianda. The note said that she and Diamond had gone to the nearby school playground and a local store and would be back soon. Tracy said her girls would never have left the apartment without her telling them they could, and they wouldn't have opened the door to any unknown person. And the rest of the Bradley family agreed. Tracy said she searched for hours that day, panicking that if she phoned the police, she would be in trouble for leaving her children alone, and this may have resulted in her other girls being taken away. However, at around 6:30 p.m., 12 hours after she had last seen them, she called 911. She initially panicked and told the police that she had simply taken a nap and woken up to realize they were missing. But after more questioning, she told them that she had left them alone to go to work. At the time of the girls' disappearance, Tianda was enrolled in summer school classes at Doolittle Elementary School, but school officials confirmed she was definitely absent that day. Several children in the neighborhood's day to the sisters were seen playing outside their apartment at around 12 p.m. Other children told the police they saw the two girls at the school playground at around lunchtime. Authorities didn't fully feel these claims could be substantiated, however, and worried the children that said they saw the girls may have got the days and times confused. In the beginning of the investigation, a rotating crew of 100 detectives worked around the clock, searching everywhere from sewers and lagoons to abandoned buildings and factories. They questioned more than 100 registered sex offenders in the area, and more than 30 relatives were interviewed and then re-interviewed. Almost 1,000 tips came in. Psychics claimed to know the location of the girls' bodies, while other people said the girls were being held as sex slaves in a small town in Illinois. Another tip said that the man who some people think may be Tianda's father, who was from Morocco, had kidnapped both girls and taken them overseas. But all of these leads went nowhere. Investigators believe whoever was involved knew the girls, and in turn the girls trusted the person or persons implicitly. Their Aunt Faith agreed and said that Tianda would not have opened the door for a stranger. In Chicago in 2001, at the time the girls went missing, there had only been 5 cases of abductions at the hands of strangers within the 15 years prior. Many people just didn't believe it was a random abduction. One day, when Tracy was being questioned by Chicago police, a vital piece of evidence was brought to light. Tracy had left her phone with family members while she was speaking with detectives, and a few people decided to check her voicemail. A voicemail had been left on the phone by 10-year-old Tianda on the morning she and her sister had disappeared. On that morning, Tracy's cell phone wasn't with her according to family members. It was with Tianda and Diamond's grandmother. It is understood that the voicemail said, "Mama, this is Tianda. Mom, pick up the phone. George is at the door. Can I open the door? He said that we're going to Jules to pick up the cake there. We're coming to pick you up from work." This cake was for her sister Victoria's birthday that was the following day. It is unclear whether Tianda was referring to George Washington or the family's neighbor, George Sr., but George was the name heard on the recording by 10 family members. For unknown reasons, this voicemail would be lost. Whether it was deleted on purpose or simply not saved, the message Tianda left no longer exists. A few days later, an image of 2 young girls resembling the pair was found on a surveillance video at the store named Jules that Tianda had spoken of in the voicemail. Police asked if Tracy could confirm whether it was her girls on the tape, but they were met with resistance from her. Tracy said she didn't believe it would be her daughters, despite not seeing the video. Tracy eventually agreed to view the footage, which was now in the hands of the FBI. But sadly, although very coincidental, it wasn't the missing pair. Another key piece of evidence was the note left on the couch. One of the girls' aunts said, other family members said that if Tianda had wanted to tell her mother something, she would have just called her cell phone, not left a note. Tianda's school provided handwriting samples, and the FBI said to the best of their knowledge, Tianda did write that note. But questions surrounding whether or not Tianda wrote it of her own accord and free will are still being asked today. Washington was interviewed by police within the first few days of the investigation. It is said he did this voluntarily and agreed to his home and vehicle being searched. Several hairs were found in the trunk of his Lincoln. Forensic testing concluded that these hairs could have belonged to either Tianda, Diamond, or Tracy, but the lack of clarity surrounding whose hairs they were, and when the hairs got there, meant there was little the police could do. As well as the hairs, Washington also had a receipt from Home Depot showing that shortly before the girls went missing, he had made some questionable purchases. Gloves, garbage bags, and bleach were all purchased at the same time, and authorities and some of the Bradley family deemed this to be suspicious. Washington also had a criminal record for burglary and soliciting prostitution. Authorities stated that Tracy was uncooperative regarding her daughter's disappearances. She did not allow police to talk to her other two children, Rita and Victoria, and she refused to give a handwriting sample to use as a comparison to the note that was found on the couch. In 2002, Tracy reportedly shoved a police officer who requested that she accompany him to the station to discuss new leads in the case. Authorities also said that Tracy missed several scheduled appointments with detectives. Tracy's spiritual advisor told the media that officers had violated her rights by forcibly taking her to the precinct. Authorities argue that Tracy was physically combative and they needed to restrain her. Tracy did take a polygraph test shortly after Tianda and Diamond disappeared, which she passed. And although police said her actions and changing stories were suspicious, she was never named as a suspect in her daughter's disappearances. Tracy moved away a few years after her girls went missing and changed her phone number. She still holds vigils for her daughters and says, I know in my heart they're still alive. Tianda and Diamond's sister Victoria said that Tracy had 2 more children after the girls disappeared, and these siblings knew nothing about Tianda and Diamond. Victoria and Rita said they had to explain to them that they had 2 other sisters and that they were missing. The girls' great aunt, Shalia Bradley Smith, said several years ago that she got in touch with the family that now has the phone linked to the number that Tracy used to have. She wanted to let them know about the girls, just in case Tianda ever dialed the number that used to be hers. Shalia has been a huge driving force in keeping the case in the public eye and has many thoughts on it too. She believes that Washington had something to do with the disappearance of her great nieces. She also believes that Tianda and Diamond actually went missing on July 5th, not the 6th. Tracy disagrees with Shalia and doesn't believe that Washington is involved. Tracy kept her on-off relationship with him going and went on to have a son with him, whom Washington took custody of. A private detective named James Miller jumped on board the case and worked free of charge to help the family. He started traveling far and wide in his search for the girls. In 2007, an email was sent to Shalia. Part of the email read, they linked this email to a MySpace page. On the page, there was a photo of a girl that bore a strong resemblance to the age-progressed photos of Tianda. When some of the children in the family saw the photo, they even asked if they had finally found her. A forensic artist named Lois Gibson was given 3 pictures from the MySpace page to compare against images of Tianda from 6 years earlier. Gibson didn't want to build up any false hope for the family, so was initially looking for signs that it wasn't her. But Gibson said, I went over every feature and went, oh my God, it's her. Sadly, the IP addresses and associated details did not link anything to Tianda Bradley. The hope of the family came crashing down even more when a man came forward and said the girl in the photo was his daughter, and through DNA, this was confirmed. In 2013, Shalia received another email. The sender lived in Gary, Indiana. She said in the email she needed to clear her conscience. She said on the morning the girls had disappeared, her boyfriend was unaccounted for. Later that evening, when he turned up, he was visibly shaken and distressed. He told her that he had done something messed up and stated, "She saw it, I had to kill her." These details were passed on to the police, who made contact with the sender. Police remained very tight-lipped about this tip. For unknown reasons, the sender, once cooperative, suddenly stopped engaging with the police and no longer wanted to give information. In 2017, private investigator James Miller, who had dedicated so many years to trying to find the girls, passed away after a battle with cancer. Tianda and Diamond's family were devastated and didn't feel it would be as easy as someone simply carrying on his behalf, due to the amount he had personally put into the case. Detective Ed Carroll, a Chicago police veteran for 26 years, worked the case on and off until his retirement in 2013. He said, "Almost every case I've ever worked, especially the violent crimes, you're always able to either include someone or exclude someone, and this was the only case I worked in my entire career where I couldn't exclude anyone or include anyone." In 2019, Shalaya posted on the Missing Diamond and Tianda Bradley Facebook page, pleading for the girls to come home. Shalaya said a woman responded saying, "We're trying." Through a series of messages, Shalaya said she went on to say that she was Tianda and that she and Diamond have been together this entire time, that they both have kids and Diamond is in college. The woman was willing to take a DNA test to prove she was Tianda, but this was nothing more than a cruel hoax. Every year, the family holds a vigil on the anniversary of their disappearance to honor the girls and hopefully spark more interest in the case. Today, the release of this episode falls on July 6, 2021, and this marks the 20th anniversary of the disappearance of Tianda and Diamond Bradley. If you have any information relating to the disappearance or whereabouts of Tianda Bradley and Diamond Bradley, I've left links in the description box for any tips that people may wish to leave that could help locate them. Susan Seymour Adams, aged 42, resided in Austin, Texas with her husband, Tom. They both enjoyed the outdoors, although Susan was less adventurous compared to Tom. She preferred activities like birdwatching and leisurely walks in the woods, while Tom was drawn to more challenging outdoor pursuits. In 1990, the couple spent several months preparing for a trip to the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness near the Idaho-Montana border. They booked their trip through Iron Horse Outfitters, an outfitting and guide business, to ensure that they would have a memorable but safe time in such a remote area. On September 22nd, the couple arrived in Idaho Falls and then drove to Hamilton, Montana. There, they met up with Art Griffith, the owner of Iron Horse Outfitters. On September 26th, the three of them embarked on the journey to the campsite Art's company owned. The camp was in the Battle Lake area, not far from the Bitterroot Divide. The final leg of the trip to reach the camp was a 7-hour-long horseback ride. On September 29th, Tom and one of the guides from the camp set out on an overnight hunting trip. Susan and another guide rode on horseback with them up to a ridge above the camp. There they parted ways. Tom and his guide began their excursion, and Susan and the other guide brought the 4 horses back to the camp. This ridge would be the last place Tom Adams saw his wife. Tom and his guide returned to camp the following afternoon. When they arrived, Susan was not there. The camp's cook said that Susan had told him that morning that she was going to a nearby meadow to spend some time doing some bird watching, but had never returned. When she left the camp, Susan had only binoculars and a camera with her. Tom immediately began looking for Susan in the area surrounding the camp. When it began getting dark, he expanded the area he was searching. He finally found some of her tracks on a trail. He followed the footprints to a spot roughly 20 feet away from the meadow, where they abruptly stopped. The guides from the outfitting company helped search for Susan all throughout the night, and the following morning one of them rode on horseback 25 miles to get help. The weather was a major obstacle in the search for Susan. 2 days after she went missing, snow began to fall, and the search had to be called off. After a week, the weather cleared up enough for the search to resume, but it only went on for another 3 days before more snow forced the efforts to be halted for the winter. Unable to search for Susan in the wilderness, authorities spent this time investigating the last people to see her. Tom, the cook, and at least one of the guides from the camp were all given polygraph examinations. They all passed. In 1991, a massive search was launched to try and find Susan's remains. Tom Adams worked for the governor of Texas, who helped get resources for the search. Helicopters, the National Guard, tracking dogs, and numerous volunteers were all a part of the effort. Members of the search teams covered acres and acres of territory, walking almost shoulder to shoulder in an effort to make sure they did not miss any potential clues. During the course of the search, some footprints were discovered, although they were not conclusively linked to Susan. The tracks appeared to be from someone who was injured, with their left foot angled out to an unusual degree, indicating that it was fractured or sprained. No other sign of Susan was found, either in 1991 or since. Arvin Nelson was a popular member of the community in Big Sur, California. The 55-year-old was a longtime server at the Big Sur River Inn. His sweet and outgoing personality made him known to almost all of the town's local residents. Arvin was also an avid outdoorsman who was very familiar with most of the terrain in the area. On August 6, 2014, he decided to begin a backpacking trip through an area he had not previously. He had a friend drop him off at the China Camp trailhead in the Los Padres National Forest. He planned to spend a week hiking the eastern side of the Ventana Wilderness, passing through Sykes Hot Springs on his way back to Big Sur. The area was very remote, but Arvin packed enough food and equipment to help him survive in the wilderness for that extended period of time. Arvin made sure that people knew about his plans and that he expected to return home by August 14th. He left instructions with a friend to notify authorities if he did not arrive back in Big Sur when planned. August 14th came and went with no sign of Arvin. On August 16th, he was reported missing. The subsequent investigation discovered that the last known people to see Arvin were Jack English and his son Dennis. They had an isolated cabin in the Pine Valley area of the Ventana Wilderness. The day he entered the wilderness, having discovered the cabin by following the sound of Dennis playing guitar, the three of them struck up a conversation and spent the following 2 days playing music and hiking around the area. When Jack and Dennis left the area by helicopter on August 8th, Arvin told them that he was going to remain in the area until the morning of the 10th, when he would continue on his planned hike. A massive search effort was launched by the local sheriff's department to look for Arvin. The National Guard, the U.S. Forest Service, the California Highway Patrol, and the Coast Guard all aided in the effort. 3 helicopters and 1 small airplane conducted an aerial search. Dozens of volunteers turned out each day for the ground search, and search and rescue teams from 4 different counties all helped look for Arvin. Typically, this kind of search would only be conducted for 5 to 7 days. However, since Arvin had the skills and the supplies needed to survive in the wilderness, the search continued on beyond this window, even without it producing any clues. The final ground search was conducted on the 9th day of the effort. The aerial search continued on for a few days before wrapping up. No sign of Arvin or his belongings has ever been found. Connie Johnson had decades of experience working in the wilderness. She had worked as a U.S. Forest Service wilderness ranger at the Moose Creek Ranger Station in the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forests. She had also been a member of the Selway Bitterroot Foundation, leading tours of the Idaho backcountry. Even at 76 years old, she maintained an active lifestyle in a remote area. In 2018, she was working as a camp cook for Ritchie Outfitters. The company's camp was in the Fog Mountain area, near Big Rock, in a remote part of the national forest that could only be reached on foot or by horseback. On October 2nd, a group of hunters left the camp to go out deeper into the wilderness to hunt. The following day, they were in contact with Connie over their radios. However, they could not make out what Connie was saying. When they arrived back at camp on October 5th, Connie and her beloved border collie were gone. Several teams of tracking dogs were brought in to search for Connie. In the U.S. Air Force, the Idaho National Guard, and the Clearwater County Backcountry Helicopter Rescue Team all contributed aircraft for the aerial search. Members of the search teams combed the area on foot and on horseback. None of these efforts located Connie or Ace, and the official search was eventually called off on October 14th. An area pilot spotted a dog at the Moose Creek Ranger Station airstrip, 15 miles from where Connie was last seen. It was Ace. After he was fed, he was examined by a vet and found to be in good health. He had lost weight during the time he had been missing, but was otherwise perfectly fine. Once Ace was cared for, Connie's family worked with a non-profit search dog organization out of Montana to transport him back to the search area in hopes that he would lead them to Connie. The effort was unsuccessful. Connie's disappearance remains unsolved. 28-year-old David Morrison was originally from Fresno, California, but was living in San Francisco and working as a chef there in 1998. That Memorial Day weekend, David and a group of his friends decided to visit Yosemite National Park. On the morning of Memorial Day, May 25th, David decided to hike up to Yosemite's famous Half Dome. He left Curry Village in Little Yosemite Valley, where the group had been staying, around 7:15 and told his girlfriend that he would be back later in the afternoon. David has not been seen since. David was an experienced hiker, but he had essentially no equipment with him on this particular excursion, carrying only a belt bag around his waist. He left for his hike wearing layers, but the thickest of them was a sweatshirt, which would have provided little protection against the snow that fell that night. Another 4 inches of snow would fall later in the week. The weather complicated the search effort for David, both because it made hiking difficult for the search teams and because the snow covered up potential clues like tracks that could have led to David, who was presumed to be lost and most likely injured. Resources were also diverted away from the search for David the day after he was last seen, when 2 trapped climbers needed to be rescued. The search effort included David's family, numerous volunteers, teams of search dogs, and a helicopter. Despite all of this effort, David and his belongings were not found. 3 days after David was last seen, members of the search team found 6 tracks. The tread impressions in them matched the kind that would be left by the type of shoes David had been wearing. It could not be confirmed that the tracks belonged to David, and they did not help locate him. The full-scale search ended the Friday after David went missing. The search then entered a limited technical mode, with only a dozen trained climbers and 24 search dogs continuing to search for David. David's family has continued to return to Yosemite every year to look for him and to visit the small memorial his mother placed near Half Dome. His family hopes that even after more than 20 years, they will be able to find David's body and resolution to his disappearance. 53-year-old Teresa Schmidt lived in Avon, Indiana, where she worked as a social worker. In September of 2002, she traveled to Colorado with her husband. He was an anesthesiologist and was attending a medical conference there. The couple was staying at the Lost Valley Guest Ranch during their trip. On September 6th, Teresa decided to go for a hike. She left her room at the ranch with 2 water bottles and a jacket in her backpack. She was seen hiking along a trail that led to an overlook on the east side of the ranch's property around 3 p.m. that afternoon. She was never seen again after that. Teresa was an experienced hiker and had stayed at the ranch in the past, so she was familiar with the area. However, a recent forest fire had dramatically changed the area's landscape, so Teresa may not have been able to rely on visual clues to guide her back to her room like she may have expected to. Teresa's husband reported her missing at 7 p.m. the day she was last seen, when she did not meet him back in their room, but the search for her was not started until 2 a.m. on September 7th. The search was extensive, however. More than 70 volunteers helped search for Teresa, and authorities used tracking dogs and helicopters. Teresa's husband used a motorcycle to cover a larger area during his own several-day search. Were 2 sets of footprints, one on each side of nearby Chessman Overlook, believed to belong to her. Neither she nor any of her belongings have ever been found. Teresa's family, acknowledging that she most likely succumbed to the elements while lost in the wilderness, held a memorial service for her after she went missing. However, her case remains unsolved, and her family is still waiting to give her a proper burial. On April 24, 1980, in Sacramento, California, a horrible discovery was made. Robin Brooks had missed her shift at the donut shop she worked at. The 20-year-old had recently moved to the area from New York and worked 2 jobs to afford her new apartment. She was last seen the previous evening. She worked a late shift at the donut shop and finished at midnight. She said goodbye to her coworker and left. Her apartment was only around the corner from the shop and should have only taken her minutes to get home. The next day, Robin failed to show up for her 4 p.m. shift, and her coworkers found that unusual. Robin was incredibly dependable, and it wasn't like her to not show up. A friend walked over to her apartment and knocked on the door several times with no answer. She knew something was wrong. She went back to the shop and got another coworker, and they forced their way into the apartment. Robin was found in her bedroom. Her friends described what they saw that day. She had been stabbed several times, and her killer had punctured her waterbed, making for an even more traumatic scene. The police were called, who also determined that she'd been sexually assaulted. Robin didn't have a car, and she only recently moved to the apartment since it was closer to her job. There were no immediate suspects. Robin didn't have a boyfriend or anyone around her that may hurt her. None of her neighbors reported any disturbances that evening, but it would have been quite late when the attack occurred. The coworker that had seen her the previous evening remembered when Robin was telling her that she had washed all of her bedding before her shift, and it was unfair that she had to make her bed before being able to go to bed so late. Officers noted that Robin's bed was not made at the crime scene, leading them to believe that her killer likely attacked her soon after she arrived home. Her sister stated that she had been told by some friends that Robin might have had a stalker. In the days leading up to her murder, Robin had committed a murder, complained to friends that a customer at work had been bothering her. Officers had not been able to locate that man for questioning. At the crime scene, officers were able to recover some evidence. Most notable was DNA evidence found at the scene. A sample of blood determined not to belong to the victim was discovered, and it appeared that the killer had cut himself during the attack. There were also fingerprints on the windowsill indicating that's how the killer got in and out of the apartment. Though despite a thorough investigation, the case eventually went cold. A profile for the DNA evidence was generated years later in 2004, but never came up as a match in state databases or federal databases. It did, however, link to a second victim that had been attacked and assaulted 3 weeks before Robin's murder. In 2017, Parabon Nanolabs created a genetic snapshot of the suspect. They used the genetic markers to make an estimation of what the suspect might look like. But the real break in the case came in 2020 when the DNA was approved for funding for genetic genealogy testing, and after 4 decades they had a match. Philip Wilson was arrested in April 2020 and was charged with the murder of Robin Brooks. The now 73-year-old would have been 30 at the time of the murder, and law enforcement discovered that he lived near Robin's apartment complex and had been a regular at the donut shop. He had never been a suspect and didn't have any run-ins with the law after Robin had been murdered. While in the trial he maintained his innocence despite extensive evidence, his lawyer argued that they had a consensual encounter and that the blood evidence was from a workplace injury. The other sexual assault case that Wilson's DNA was linked to could not be brought into this trial, and he cannot be charged as the statute of limitations has expired on that case. Initially, the jury was hung on the conviction, but on March 9, 2022, they came back with a unanimous guilty verdict. Robin's sister Maria Eriks said after the verdict was read, Wilson's defense attorney has indicated that they will likely appeal the conviction, but as of this reporting, they have not. Sentencing is set for sometime in April. It was a Sunday afternoon on November 6, 1983, when 11-year-old Laura Ann Weiser was walking home from a friend's house in Fort Pierce, Florida. Her parents noticed that she was late coming home. They called the friend that Laura had been with and discovered that Laura had left her friend's house hours ago. They did a quick search of the area, and when they couldn't find Laura, they went to the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office to report her missing. A large-scale search by law enforcement was never undertaken, but they did put out a bolo bee on the lookout sheet for her. A deputy who came forward, James Howard Harrison, saying that he saw the girl walking near a gas station. Harrison had been on patrol that day she went missing, and it had been in his area of patrol. He gave the estimated time he saw her and claimed to have continued his patrol without talking to her. Feisty and outspoken, her family claimed she never would have gotten in a vehicle with a stranger and that she was very street smart. There was disappointment that the local authorities didn't do more to find Laura, and and 3 days later her body was found in a citrus grove less than 600 yards from her home. The medical examiner confirmed that she had been murdered the day she had been reported missing. Her cause of death was strangulation, and she had been sexually assaulted. 2 men that worked in the citrus grove had discovered her body. When they called the police, it was James Harrison who arrived first on the scene. The men said that Harrison took brief statements and dismissed the men. No one from the STCSO ever followed up with the men. Harrison was alone at the crime scene for 20 minutes before other officers joined him. The investigation had been brief, no suspects were ever identified, and the case was quickly filed away, not revisited for nearly 4 decades. In 2020, the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office established a dedicated cold case squad, and it was Laura Ann's cold case that was selected for the team to reinvestigate. Detective Paul Taylor was in charge of the investigation. Early on, it was discovered that there were many holes in the initial investigation. Detective Taylor interviewed one of the men who had initially discovered Laura's body, and had been shocked that he was the first officer, besides Deputy Harrison, to talk to him. The man remembered that day vividly, and the crime scene, as he had explained that it had been a deeply traumatic discovery. He explained what he saw that day with crystal clear details, but Detective Taylor had been shocked to realize that it didn't match what was in the file. The man had told him that Harrison had asked the 2 men to leave, which they thought had been strange. And what had been more strange was that no one else wanted to talk to them further. For the first time, there seemed to be a suspect in the murder of Laura and it was one of their own. Detective Harrison was also a preacher in the region. Taylor discovered that 5 months after Laura's murder, Harrison was let go at the sheriff's office. Several accusations had come forward that Harrison had molested several young girls in his church. Harrison also had complaints brought forward from within the sheriff's office as co-workers felt he'd been inappropriate with young women while conducting his duties as a deputy. Detective Taylor uncovered several definitive instances where Harrison directly tampered with evidence, moved things in the crime scene, and had hindered the investigation. Harrison was never charged. He was let go from his job and kicked out of his church, so he and his family picked up and moved. Harrison actually moved a lot, working in law enforcement in 10 separate agencies within Florida, Orange, Orlando, Osceola, Edgewood, Glades, and Okeechobee counties. Because he was never formally charged, he was allowed to just start over in a new county, using both the church and his uniform to maintain access to potential victims. James Howard Harrison died in 2008, and in 2020 his body was exhumed for DNA collection. DNA collected from the crime scene had been poorly stored and conditions had degraded the sample, and they wouldn't be able to get a definitive 100% match. However, they are certain that Harrison is responsible for the murder of Laura and Weiser. Based on witness statements, the tampering of evidence, and the history of sexual assaults of little girls, the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office have stated that they are certain that Harrison killed Laura Ann. They've also input his DNA into federal and state databases, and his DNA is being tested in several other cold cases in Florida to determine how many other victims he had. It was on March 20th, 1976 when Elizabeth Ann Wilson went missing from her place of work mid-shift. The 45-year-old mother was working an overnight shift as a spinner at a textiles factory in Chester, South Carolina. Halfway through her shift and last seen at the cafeteria around 3:45 a.m., a coworker said she saw her resume work around 4 a.m. and didn't notice anything unusual. Not long after, a security guard thought he saw Elizabeth and in a vehicle, a green and white Chevrolet belonging to a manager of the plant, and allowed the vehicle out of the facility. This wasn't unusual. The manager had been known to drive employees that were sick or if there was an emergency and either took people home or to the hospital. However, it hadn't been the manager driving. When he finished his shift, he noticed that his car was missing and reported it as stolen to the police. At that time, it was noticed that Elizabeth Ann was missing. Around 7 a.m., a motorist noticed an abandoned vehicle on the highway. He saw what he believed to be a body under the car and went straight to the home of a nearby sheriff's deputy. They went back to the vehicle together and confirmed it was a deceased half-clothed woman underneath. Initially, it had been thought that she had been hit by a car, but an autopsy revealed she had been strangled to death, severely beaten, and sexually assaulted. It had been the second vicious attack in the area that week, and there was concern that the crimes had been in the work of a serial predator. But it was later determined that the attacks were either a coincidence or a copycat. Elizabeth Ann was confirmed as the victim, but no one could figure out what had happened. The security guard hadn't gotten a good look at the driver the night that she'd gone missing. There had been no obvious signs of distress. Law enforcement had interviewed several suspects, but all were cleared. She had been a widow, her husband had died a little bit before her, and her 2 daughters were grown, married, and had families of their own. The state offered a $5,000 reward for any information that led to an arrest, but nothing solid came of it. DNA found at the scene was input into federal and state databases, and nothing came of it for years, until 2020 when they finally got a match from a recent convicted felon. Charles Eugene Coleman, now 66 years old, had been convicted of pointing and threatening a weapon. He was required to submit DNA at the time of his arrest, which connected him to the murder from 1976. Coleman had an extensive criminal history, which included a 12-year prison sentence for assault and battery in 1977. His other convictions were assault and battery with intent to kill, larceny, and other minor felonies. He was charged with the murder of Elizabeth and Howell Wilson in 2020. And in 2022 he entered an Alford plea, meaning he would not accept guilt, but acknowledged there was sufficient evidence to convict him and would accept the punishment. South Carolina law stated that he needed to be sentenced based on the laws in 1976, which gives him the option to be eligible for parole in 9 years. The sexual assault charges were dropped as part of the plea agreement. He has already served 16 months and will be eligible for parole in 2029, expressing relief that there was some justice in her mother's brutal murder. In 1933, the 22-year-old was nearing the completion of his astronomy doctorate at the University of Chicago. Over the summer, he worked at the university's Yerkes Observatory in Williams Bay, Wisconsin. While Joe excelled in math and science, he also had a talent for languages, being fluent in French and German, and proficient in reading and writing Cyrillic. Despite his scholarly pursuits, Joe had a playful and humorous side. He enjoyed using his wit to entertain and occasionally played pranks on his friends. Joe had a deep love for the outdoors, which led him to embark on a road trip in August with his parents and his friend, Sam Gehrig, who was the brother of Joe's best friend, Isidore Gehrig. Isidore had originally been asked to go on the trip, but when he was unable to, Sam went in his place. Joe's brother Bernard also could not make the trip. The group of 4 left the Halpern home in Chicago and first drove west to South Dakota and then drove south from there to Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. While visiting the park, the group stayed at the Glacier Basin Campground. On August 15, 1933, Sam and Joe left Joe's parents at the campground so that they could go on a hike. They drove from the campground in the family's Ford sedan and parked at the Bear Lake trailhead. From there, they hiked towards Flat Top Mountain, which was a very popular route. While Joe enjoyed hiking, his friend Sam was not as interested in it. By 2 p.m., after they had summit Flat Top Mountain, Sam was ready to turn back for the day and return to the campground. Joe was not. The two got into a friendly argument about whether or not to continue on, as they stopped just northwest of the summit of Hallett Peak on the trail. This was confirmed by another guest staying at the campground, who ran into the pair while they were debating what to do. Ultimately, Joe and Sam decided to each go their own way. Sam hiked back down the trail and promised to wait for Joe back at the car. Joe continued hiking because he wanted to reach Taylor Peak. Sam would be the last person to definitively see Joe. Sam arrived back at the Bear Lake trailhead at approximately 6:30 p.m. and began waiting for Joe. He knew he would be standing around waiting for his friend for a while, but by 9 p.m. he felt that his wait had been far too long. By 9:30 he contacted a ranger. By 10 o'clock, the official search for Joe began. Due to the darkness that had fallen by the time the search was mobilized, the efforts on that first night were limited to rangers with electric lamps searching the immediate area around where Joe had last been seen. The following day, the search effort expanded greatly. More than 150 volunteers would help look for Joe in the following few days. Park rangers tried to bring in bloodhounds, but there were none available in the area. Rangers checked the registers on Taylor Peak and at other nearby peaks in the park, but Joe had not signed any of them. Sam Gehrig and Joe's father, Solomon, performed their own searches as well. During these searches, the pair covered an average of 15 miles per day. No sign of Joe or any of his belongings were found during the extensive searches. The official search for Joe was finally called off on August 21st. The Halperns and Sam Garrick left the park to return to Chicago that same day. While Joe loved hiking, he was not a particularly skilled hiker. Furthermore, he did not have a lot of supplies with him when he left the campground on August 15th. It is believed that he only had a few sandwiches, an orange, and some bananas in his gray knapsack. He had been wearing heavy boots on his hike with Sam, but the rest of his clothing was a blue shirt and khaki pants. The only equipment he had, so to speak, was a 1933 motorist's map of the park. In the days after Joe went missing, the weather in the park was pleasant during the day, but temperatures dropped into the 40s overnight, and several nights were plagued by windstorms and rain. Even if Joe remained alive in the park after his first night, he would have been cold, wet, and hungry, which would have severely reduced the chances that he remained alive as the days passed on. The superintendent of Rocky Mountain National Park, Edmund Rogers, indicated in his monthly report for August of 1933 that he believed that Joe had ended up trying to descend from Taylor Peak too late in the day, after it had gotten dark. In the darkness, he tripped and fell, and he and his belongings ended up stuck in a crevice where the search teams could not find them. This is, of course, the most simple and logical answer to this mystery. Joe's nephew, Roland Halpern, has put forth an alternate but related theory. He thinks that it is possible that his mischievous uncle, who was known to play tricks on his friends, tried to play a prank on Sam Garrick. Sam was expecting to wait for Joe back at the trailhead because he was going back there directly, while Joe was hiking up Taylor Peak. Joe may have decided to try to beat Sam back to the trailhead to startle him. He could have done this if he came back down via the Tyndall Glacier. In his haste to carry out the joke, he could have fallen off a cliff or into the glacier itself. Joe's parents, however, did not give up hope that he had somehow made it out of the park alive. They feared that their son may have hit his head and developed amnesia and was wandering around, unsure of who he was or how to contact them. The Halperns, who had worked with the park service while searching for Joe immediately after his disappearance, also reported him missing to the police after they arrived home, in case Joe had made it out of the park and out of the park service's jurisdiction. Solomon Halpern wrote to the superintendent of the park, telling him that he and his wife had taken this action in case Joe had wandered away due to some injury having affected his reason or memory, or for some other reason. The Halperns realized that there may have been some other reason for Joe to disappear when they reached out to Joe's best friend, Isidore Garrick. Isidore provided them with letters Joe had written to him, and those letters hinted at the possibility that Joe was not as satisfied with his life and career path as he had appeared. Joe was apparently struggling under the burden of his own intelligence and was becoming disillusioned with academia. In some of his letters, he alluded to becoming a hobo and seemed to glorify the transient lifestyle of sailors and outdoorsmen. While Isidore was positive that Joe would not have hurt his loved ones by leaving without warning, Joe's parents were just happy to have one more reason to believe that their son was still alive somewhere. Their hopes were further bolstered in 1934 when a family acquaintance came to visit their house. The acquaintance had never met Joe and did not know about his disappearance, but when he saw a picture of Joe on display in the home, he told the Halperns that he had seen the man in the picture begging for food outside of a restaurant in Phoenix, Arizona in the winter of 1933. The Halperns immediately reached out to the owner of the restaurant, who agreed to help them. They sent him a picture of Joe and he took it to the Phoenix police. They in turn took the picture to an area transient camp. And some of the boys living there claimed that Joe had been staying there 3 months earlier, although using a different name. In 1936, a family friend of the Halperns named Sam Greenfield wrote to the FBI, stating that he believed Joe had been working for the Lewis Brothers Circus in 1935, and using the name Louis Hollenbuck. A man with that name was eventually identified, but his age precluded him from being Joe. Neither of these sightings were ever substantiated, but kept hope alive for the Halperns. For years, they continued to write to the FBI, as well as to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, asking for help in finding Joe. Joe's fingerprints were available because he had provided them when he opened a postal account. The FBI agreed to put these prints in a missing persons file, but since there was no evidence that a federal law had been broken in relation to Joe's disappearance, There was little else they had the authority to do. Joe's parents petitioned the courts to have their son legally presumed dead in 1950. But as their continuing search for him shows, they do not appear to have ever really given up hope that they would one day find and be reunited with their younger son. Over the years, they kept in contact with Joe's best friend Isidore through the mail. They eventually moved away from Chicago and onto a farm in Indiana. In addition to the main house, the Halperns also had 2 small guest cabins on their property. One was for their older son Bernard and his family to stay in when they came to visit, and the Halperns hoped that the other cabin would one day serve the same purpose for Joe. Sam Garrick eventually became a physician, had children, and then passed away in 1976. Isidore Garrick, Joe's best friend, passed away in 1981. He had a daughter, Linda, who would one day be the person who provided Roland Halpern with Isidore's copies of letters he had sent out after Joe's disappearance. In these letters, Isidore asserts to Joe's parents and to the Park Service that Joe would not have intentionally disappeared. Isidore kept this correspondence and other documents related to his friend's disappearance with his personal papers until his death. Would have a son, Roland Halpern, almost 20 years after Joe vanished. Roland has described his father as being very stoic, an attitude he attributes to his father's life during the Great Depression. Bernard almost never discussed his missing brother, and the only reason Roland even knew about Joe growing up was because Bernard would warn him against going hiking alone, lest he go missing like his Uncle Joe. Roland discovered that his father had continued to work to find out what had become of his brother for decades after he disappeared. Amongst his father's papers and tucked into books, Roland found photographs and letters that detailed Bernard's passionate search for Joe and the frustration he felt at the lack of answers. Bernard had continued writing letters to various government agencies, from the Park Service to the FBI, and following up on leads. Bernard had started his efforts, hoping that he could solve the mystery of Joe's appearance for their parents. But he continued his quest to find his brother, even after both his mother and father had passed away. Roland has now inherited the task of learning what happened to his Uncle Joe. The largest task he has undertaken involves collecting, cataloging, and digitizing all of the numerous letters involved in the case. He has the letters sent between Joe and Isidore Garrick, letters between his grandparents and Isidore, letters his grandparents sent to different government agencies, and letters his own father sent off on behalf of Joe. He has used these letters to find clues to help follow up on the reported sightings of Joe, inform his own opinions on the case, and learn what he can about the uncle he never had a chance to meet. He also does research into unidentified remains and has been in contact with various law enforcement agencies about using DNA to potentially identify those belonging to Joe. Roland hopes to find answers in the case on behalf of his father and grandparents and all of the decades they spent working to find Joe. Given the fact that Joe Halpern would now be well over 100 years old, it seems unlikely that he is still alive. However, Roland Halpern still hopes to answer the question of what happened to his uncle and to locate him. While it may seem that the only benefit of locating Joe's remains would be the peace it would bring to Roland and his family, it would also have more practical and tangible benefits. Joe's parents are both buried in Florida. Roland has purchased a burial plot near where they are laid to rest, in hopes of one day burying the remains of the son they spent so many years searching for, close to them. Tricia Reitler was a bright and affectionate 19-year-old freshman at Indiana Wesleyan University in Marion, Indiana. She was studying psychology with the goal of one day helping to mend fractured families. On March 29, 1993, a surprisingly warm day in Marion, Tricia, who loved running, went for 2 separate runs to enjoy the weather. That evening, she dedicated her time to writing a term paper in her dorm room. Around 8 p.m., Tricia took a break from her studies and decided to walk to Marsh Supermarket, which was just half a mile away. There, she purchased a root beer and a magazine. She then began the walk back to her dorm room in Bowman Hall. She never arrived. Tricia's clothes, stained with blood, were eventually discovered roughly halfway between the store and her dorm building, in a tree in a grassy area. An earring and a small amount of blood was found on a nearby sidewalk. A search was launched to find her, with the effort including fellow students from the university. Search dogs were also brought in to look for Tricia, But Trisha's father Gary believes that Trisha's active lifestyle may have rendered the dogs less useful than they ordinarily would have been. Because Trisha ran so frequently, and the search area was so close to where she lived and went to school, her scent was everywhere because she went for runs all around the area. Investigators believe that 6 or 7 people had been playing basketball on a court near where Trisha went missing, but none of those individuals ever came forward or provided information. The search effort and police investigation did not locate Trisha. Over the years, multiple suspects have been considered in Trisha's disappearance. One of those suspects did confess to involvement in Trisha's case, Larry Dwayne Hall, who but has confessed to 30 others. Most of those confessions were ultimately recanted. I have previously covered Hall in relation to the disappearance of Lori Deppis. Like in Lori's case, Hall had newspaper clippings and notes about Trisha's disappearance in his vehicle. Like in Lori's case, he confessed and offered to tell authorities where she was buried, but a search of that area, in Trisha's case, near a reservoir in Grant County, Indiana, found nothing. Hall later recanted his confession in Trisha's case. In 2017, he admitted to retired Marion police detective J.K. that he made up the confession to get attention. No physical evidence has ever been found to link Hall to Trisha's disappearance. 5 years after Trisha went missing, a red sunset maple tree was planted in her memory in Sable Park, near where she vanished. To mark the 25th anniversary of her disappearance, a memorial was constructed on the Indiana Wesleyan campus. Trisha's parents and 3 siblings still go out to dinner every year on February 9th to mark Trisha's birthday. While they do not believe that she is alive, they still hope to be able to find Trisha and give her a proper burial, both so that they will have some answers about what happened to her, and so that they will have a place to go to remember her beyond the memorial on campus. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.